They laughed when he planted trees along his road. Those trees blocked wind and saved 200 acres. The topsoil moved in March. Walt Greer stood at the edge of his south field on a Thursday morning and watched it go. He was 62 years old, had been farming the same 680 acres south of Larned, Kansas, since 1949. He knew the wind, knew what it could take. The morning was cold. March 8, 1979, the southwest wind had started before dawn, and by 7 a.m. it was holding at 28 miles per hour, measured with the handheld anemometer he kept clipped to the sun visor of his F-100. He stood at the field margin in his canvas work coat with the collar up and watched fine dark soil lift off the surface in slow, continuous sheets. Not a dust storm. Not dramatic. Just steady, patient theft. 30 years of farming the Pawnee County bottomland had taught him the difference between wind that rattled the fence wire and wind that cost money. This was the second kind. The land had been in the Greer family since 1929. Walt's father, Chester Greer, had broken the original 320 acres and held them through the 30s. The dirty 30s. Chester had watched half the county blow away, and had stayed anyway. He'd passed the property to Walt in 1951 and added 360 acres on the south end that he'd bought for $18 an acre from a family that was leaving. Good ground. Flat and dark and well-drained. But open. Always open. Chester had talked about windbreaks, had driven past the government shelter belts planted along highway corridors in the late 30s, and said the men who planted those knew something. He never planted them himself. Never got to it. Walt had not gotten to it either. Not until March of 1979, when the ground was moving again and Roy Estes's probe had given him a number he couldn't put out of his mind. He walked to County Road 14. The road bordered the east edge of his property for half a mile, running straight south to the section line. The road ditch was collecting his topsoil. 2 inches of dark brown drift pressed against the fence posts. Walt crouched down and worked it through his fingers. Fine, loose, light. 1,000 years of accumulated organic material sitting in a ditch. He stayed there a while. The wind pushed against his back. The fields to the west and north belonged to Leon Duffy and his brother Raymond. Same situation. Same bare surface. Same thin winter wheat stubble that hadn't held the ground since October. The whole county was losing something that morning. The Extension Office had mailed a bulletin in February recommending deep blade cultivation to break the surface crust and reduce erosion. Walt had tried that in 1977. $11 an acre to run the chisel plow across 200 acres. The following spring, the wind still moved soil. Roy Estes from the Pawnee County Soil Conservation District had driven out the previous Tuesday with a probe and a clipboard. Walt had called him in February after reading the soil loss estimates in the Extension Bulletin. Roy pushed his probe into the ground at 6 points across the south fields, compared the readings against records from 1974, and wrote a number on his pad. He turned it around and showed it to Walt. 0.8 inches in 5 years. Roy said it was consistent with county trends. South-facing fields with no protective cover were showing the worst numbers in Pawnee County. He unfolded a county map with erosion risk zones shaded. Walt's south 200 acres sat in the darkest shading on the map. Roy did not have a recommendation beyond what the Extension Office had already mailed. He capped his probe, thanked Walt for the coffee, and drove back to Larned. Walt stood in the road ditch and looked at his fence line. Half a mile of flat, open ground. No trees. No hedge. Nothing between his fields and the Oklahoma Panhandle but distance and open air. The southwest wind had a clear, unobstructed run. Always had. He had been thinking about trees for 2 years, since the fall of 1977, when he'd driven past a farmstead on Highway 56, 7 miles east. An old Osage orange hedge still stood there from the 30s, planted during the New Deal Shelter Belt program. The fields behind that hedge were different. Soil darker. Surface intact. No drift at the fence. Walt had slowed the truck to look. The hedge was 30 feet tall in places. The branches had grown together until you could not see through it. He drove home without stopping. But he noticed. The Extension office in Larned had held a soil conservation meeting on February 6th. Walt drove in. Sat in the back of the courtroom at the Pawnee County Courthouse with about 30 other farmers. Gerald Haynes presented. Gerald had been with K-State Extension for 12 years. He covered deep blade cultivation, chemical soil binders, minimum till methods, summer fallow rotation. He had charts and printed handouts and a measured professional manner. 45 minutes. Walt raised his hand near the end, asked about windbreaks. Tree rows planted along field margins to reduce wind velocity before it reached cropland. Gerald Haynes looked at him, said trees competing for moisture in the first 80 feet of cropland could cost a farmer more than the wind erosion would. Said the water table in Pawnee County was too variable for reliable large-scale establishment. Said the published research for this region did not support windbreak planting as a primary erosion strategy. Walt thanked him. Sat back down. He drove home on County Road 14. Watched his fence line the entire way. The chemical soil binder Gerald had recommended cost $47 per acre to apply. Walt's South 200 acres would run $9,400. Reapplication needed every 2 to 3 years. The binder worked on the surface only. Did nothing about the wind. The wind would still come at 28 miles per hour from the southwest. The soil would still loosen. The binder would need reapplying. The cost would repeat. Walt called Roy Estes the following week. Asked about tree seedlings through the county's soil conservation office. Roy told him the State Forestry Division sold through county offices. Eastern red cedar and green ash. Available in bundles of 50 seedlings for $17.50 a bundle. 35 cents per tree. Walt said he wanted 7 bundles. 350 seedlings arrived by the last week of March. Walt stored them in wet burlap in the north shed, out of the wind and cold. Word moved the way it moved. The Senex Co-op on Highway 156 in Larned was the clearing house for most of what happened in Pawnee County. On the second Saturday of April, Leon Duffy mentioned at the counter that Walt Greer had ordered a load of trees, had plans to plant them along County Road 14. Leon said it in the flat, even way men say things when they want others to do the deciding about what it means. 3 men at the counter did the deciding. Said it sounded like planting on good crop ground. Said trees on a field margin dried out the first 80 feet of soil. Said they'd heard that from the extension man. Walt planted on April 17th. He started at 6 in the morning with the Ford 5000 and a 12-inch auger bit mounted to the 3-point. The ground along the fence line was dry and packed. The auger chewed through it in short, loud bursts, leaving a sharp mineral smell in the cold air. He drilled the holes 8 feet apart, center to center, 12 inches from the road ditch fence line. Cedar, ash, cedar, ash, alternating down the half-mile stretch. The holes had to be at least 18 inches deep. Anything shallower and the taproot had no room to establish before summer heat arrived. Walt measured the first 12 holes with a wooden dowel he'd marked at 18 inches. After that, he could judge by the sound the auger made when it hit that depth. A slight change in pitch as the soil loosened. He knew what it sounded like. He used a dibble bar to set each seedling, tamped the soil around the roots by hand, and moved to the next hole. cedar first, then the ash beside it. He kept a bucket of water mixed with a handful of powdered sulfur in it, an old trick his father had used, and dipped each root ball before placing it. He did not know if it helped. Had always done it. The work took 3 days, April 17th, 18th, 19th. 340 seedlings went into County Road 14. The other 10 he planted on a short section of his north boundary line. An experiment. At planting, the cedar seedlings stood 12 to 18 inches tall. Thin stems, needles soft and dense, smelling of sap and fresh wood when he pulled them from the burlap. The ash were bare sticks, 14 to 20 inches, not yet leafed. To anyone driving County Road 14 in April 1979, it looked like Walt Greer had stuck a row of sticks along his fence. Raymond Duffy drove the road twice that week, slowed down both times. The first summer was dry. Pawnee County recorded 8.4 inches of rain between May and August, below the 30-year average by nearly 3 inches. The seedlings struggled in the hot, pale ground. 11 cedar trees died by July, root burned in the shallow, dry soil. Walt identified the weakest 22 trees in early June and began hauling water. 5-gallon buckets from the standpipe at the road corner. Twice a week through June. 8 trips, 40 minutes each, the plastic handles cutting into his palms on the walk back to the fence line. He replaced the 11 dead cedar with seedlings from the north boundary experiment, transplanting them by hand in the evening when the heat was lower. 9 of the 11 took. He lost 2 more by August. By September, the cedar averaged 6 inches of new growth. The ash had done better, 9 to 11 inches on the healthier trees. The total row from the road corner to the south section line now stood at an average height of 22 inches, with the ash reaching 30 inches in 2 places. Standing at the road corner and looking south in September 1979, you could see the row as a row, something living and intentional along the fence line. Not a windbreak. Not yet. That fall, the southwest wind came again. 2 weeks in October, steady at 25 to 35 miles per hour through the second week of November. Walt walked his south field the morning after the worst of it passed. He knelt in the soil and looked at the surface. The drift accumulation at the fence line was lighter than the previous year. Maybe the trees were 18 inches tall, too small to know anything for certain. He kept walking the field. 1980 brought better rain, 11 inches between April and August. The green ash responded fast, 14 to 18 inches of new height in a single growing season. The cedar gained 8 to 11 inches. By fall of 1980, the row along County Road 14 was visible from a moving vehicle, 2 to 2.5 feet tall on average, the ash reaching 30 inches in the better spots. A deliberate line of green that had not been on this road 2 years before. Leon Duffy stopped at Walt's place in October, said he had a question about a Farmall tractor part. He stood at the end of the road row for several minutes while Walt walked to the shed and back. He didn't say anything about the trees. 3 days later, Leon ordered a bundle of eastern red cedar from the Soil Conservation Office. Roy Estes mentioned it to Walt without making a point of it. Walt didn't say anything either. 1981 and 1982 continued. The trees grew. By fall of 1982, the ash had reached 6 to 8 feet in the better sections. The cedar was slower, 4 to 5 feet, but dense. The lower branches of adjacent cedar trees had begun to interlock at ground level, filling the gaps between trunks with solid green growth. The ash completed the upper third of the barrier. Walking County Road 14 in October 1982, the row stood 8 feet high in stretches, and 12 feet deep from road to field edge. Solid enough to put a shadow on the ditch in the afternoon sun. Walt started measuring soil moisture that fall. He used a hand-operated probe he'd bought at Graber's Farm Supply in Larned for $28. He pushed it in at 5 positions across the south 200 acres, 50 feet behind the tree row, 100 feet, 200 feet, 400 feet, and at the far south end of the field where no trees stood and no protection existed. He recorded everything in a ring-bound notebook with a green cover that he kept on the seat of the Ford pickup. November 1982 readings. Moisture at 50 feet behind the tree row averaged 3.2 inches at 12-inch depth. At 100 feet, 3 inches. At 200 feet, 2,008 inches. At 400 feet, 2,003 inches. At the open south end, 1.8 inches. He showed the notebook to Roy Estes in December. Roy looked at the numbers for a long time, said they were consistent with windbreak research from Nebraska and South Dakota. Said Walt should keep recording. Walt kept recording. The dust storm came on April 14, 1983. The Weather Service in Wichita had issued a wind advisory the previous afternoon. Southwest wind, 35 to 45 miles per hour sustained, gusts to 55. Possible blowing dust. Walt had walked his fields the day before. 3 weeks without rain, the soil was dry and loose, the kind that crumbled between your fingers without pressure, the kind that moved. The wind arrived before 7 a.m. 41 miles per hour sustained at the farm by 8 o'clock. Walt stood at the kitchen window. The sky to the southwest turned the flat brown color it turned when Pawnee County was losing ground, a dull metallic haze that blocked the horizon. By 10 a.m., he could not see County Road 14 from the house. The windows hummed. The air that leaked through the doorframe smelled of dry soil and iron. The wind held at 38 to 43 miles per hour for 11 hours. It stopped at dusk. Walt walked the south field the next morning with his probe and the green notebook. He measured at the same 5 positions he'd been measuring for 5 months. 50 feet behind the tree row, surface intact. Net loss 0.1 inches. At 100 feet, 0.1 inches. At 200 feet, 0.2 inches. At 400 feet, 0.6 inches. He walked to the south end of his property, the open end, and pushed the probe in at 3 separate spots. He wrote the average in the notebook. 1.4 inches, gone in 11 hours. He drove north on County Road 14. He did not stop at Leon Duffy's place. He drove to Raymond Duffy's farm on the section to the west. Raymond was already in his equipment shed, a single light on over the workbench. Walt stopped and got out of the truck. Raymond had numbers. He'd called Roy Estes that morning. Roy was coming out that afternoon. Raymond's south-facing fields had lost better than 2 inches of topsoil overnight. He had the probe data on a piece of paper on the workbench. The 2 men stood in the shed. Walt held his green notebook open. Raymond read the numbers at the 5 positions twice. He was quiet for a moment. He set the notebook down on the workbench carefully, like it was something he didn't want to damage. Walt didn't say anything about the co-op conversation from 4 years earlier. Raymond didn't bring it up. They talked about the storm for a while, and then Walt drove home on County Road 14. The road ditch on the west side of his property was packed with drift from the neighboring fields. Fine brown soil from the unprotected ground to the west caught against the fence posts and the road shoulder. On the east side, behind Walt's tree row, the ditch was clean. The difference was visible from the truck window at 30 miles per hour. The 1983 wheat harvest came in the second week of July. County average yield, 24 bushels per acre, reduced from what would have been a stronger year by the April storm damage. Walt's protected south 200 acres came in at 36 bushels. The unprotected 80 acres on the open south end averaged 19. Both numbers were written on the last page of the green notebook before the combine finished. Roy Estes came back in August with his own probe equipment. He spent 3 hours on Walt's property, taking measurements and asking questions. He asked to borrow the notebooks when he left. Walt gave him all 5 of them. Roy returned them on a Thursday with 2 typed pages of summary attached. He told Walt the data supported a 60 to 70% reduction in wind erosion velocity in the first 200 feet behind the tree row. Said the moisture retention numbers matched published windbreak research from the Nebraska Panhandle. Said he was going to present the findings to the Pawnee County Soil Conservation Board in October. The October 1983 board meeting was held at the courthouse in Larned. Gerald Haynes attended. He sat in the second row. Roy presented for 20 minutes. He used a hand-drawn map of Walt's property showing the tree row along County Road 14, the 5 measurement positions, the November 1982 baseline readings, the April 14th storm data, and the harvest comparison. He put the yield numbers on the chalkboard. 36 versus 24. The room stayed quiet for a moment after that. Gerald Haynes raised his hand near the end of the presentation. Asked about the species selection. Roy said eastern red cedar and green ash. Haynes wrote something on his notepad. He did not look in Walt's direction. By the fall of 1983, Walt had also established a second tree row, planted in the fall of 1981, 12 feet behind the first. Same alternating cedar and ash pattern, another 210 seedlings. He'd read a soil conservation bulletin from the Nebraska Extension Service describing double-row windbreaks, achieving velocity reduction of 80% at distances up to 10 times the tree height. He hadn't mentioned the second row at the October board meeting. Roy already knew about it. By fall of 1984, the first row averaged 14 feet. The second row, 9 feet. Roy Estes took handheld velocity readings with an anemometer on 3 separate windy days in October 1984, measuring at 50 and 100 feet behind the double row. Average velocity reduction at 100 feet, 72%. Walt wrote that number in the 6th notebook. Other farmers in Pawnee County began ordering windbreak seedlings after the 1983 storm. 6, by Walt's count, placed orders with the Soil Conservation Office in 1983 or 1984. Roy told him the county seedling program had grown from 800 trees ordered county-wide in 1979 to 4,200 in 1984. He said some of that increase connected to the October board presentation. The Duffy brothers planted a single cedar row along the south end of their shared property line in the spring of 1984, 120 seedlings. Leon came to Walt's place in March to ask about spacing. They stood in Leon's driveway for 40 minutes. Walt showed him the second notebook with the early moisture readings. Leon took notes on a brown paper bag from his truck. He drove away and planted the row that April. The trees on County Road 14 kept growing. By 1989, the first row had reached an average of 21 feet. The cedar, which had started slower than the ash, stood 18 feet tall and had grown together into an unbroken green wall from the fence line to the top of its canopy. The ash extended another 6 feet above that. Looking south from the road corner, in the fall of 1989, the 2 rows together formed a barrier that rose 24 feet at its tallest points and ran continuously for half a mile. From a distance, it looked like the land had always had trees there. Walt's south 200 acres showed an average yield improvement of 11 bushels per acre over his unprotected ground in the wind years between 1983 and 1989. Roy Estes published the Pawnee County windbreak data in a 2-page K-State Extension newsletter article in the spring of 1987. He listed the farm by location, not by name. Walt had asked him not to, and Roy hadn't argued about it. By 1989, 6 other Pawnee County farms had established windbreaks of at least 200 seedlings each. The Soil Conservation Office had developed a site plan service. A staff member would come out, assess the field orientation and prevailing wind direction, and recommend species and spacing. Roy Estes ran that service in its first year. He used Walt's property as the reference case in his site assessments. Walt knew this because 3 different farmers mentioned it when they came to look at the County Road 14 row. Gerald Haynes retired from K-State Extension in 1991. Walt farmed the 680 acres until 1997. He retired at 80 and sold the property to a man named Dale Schroeder from the county to the north, who had been watching the production records for 3 years before making an offer. The sale price for the protected South 200 acres came to $2,100 per acre. The county average for comparable dryland ground in Pawnee County that year was $1,650. The premium was recorded in the closing paperwork at the title company on Broadway in Larned. Leon Duffy told Walt in the parking lot of the title company that the trees had done what Walt said they would. Said it once, stood there a moment, and then walked to his truck. Walt told him the trees were not his idea. Said the government had planted windbreaks all across the plains in the 30s. Said they just stopped doing it. He drove County Road 14 for the last time as its owner that October. The first row had grown to 24 feet on average. The second row, 18 feet. The 2 rows had grown together in places, the spacing between them filled in. A solid line of green running half a mile. The cedar threw a shadow across the road ditch in the afternoon. He drove home. Walt Greer drove County Road 14 again in October 2004. He was 87 years old. He stopped the truck at the south end of the tree row and sat with the engine running for a while. The cedar had cleared 30 feet in several sections. The branches of the first and second rows had merged at their crowns. Standing outside the truck, you could hear the wind in the upper ash canopy, a low, continuous sound. Below it was still. He drove home, did not stop again. The trees are still there. The soil behind them is still there, still holding.